The climate and ecological emergency is humanity's greatest challenge. This is our fragile atmosphere, as thin as the skin is to an apple. We must protect it and our habitat, the natural world, or face devastating consequences. This arresting chart shows how CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere have accelerated since the Rio Earth Summit 30 years ago, through 25 climate conferences since. It's clear to see that we need bold new thinking to break this trend, something stronger than just promises. Meanwhile, the natural world is also at crisis point. Scientists tell us that Earth has entered its sixth mass extinction event, with a 68% decline in the abundance of life since 1970 and 1 million plants and animals facing extinction. Our leaders signed pledges to double protected areas, but with no policies to back up the words. Next is a look at the world's plans to eliminate fossil fuels. The IPCC told the world in 2018 that we must add no more than 420 billion tonnes of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere for a likely chance of staying within 1.5 degrees. That's known as our global carbon budget. They said we could delay reaching net zero until 2050, but only if we made ambitious near-term cuts in emissions to stretch out our carbon budget. Let's see what actually happened. COVID cut global emissions, but there was no green recovery as we were advised to do. So we are already back to pre-COVID levels. If we carry on like this, our carbon budget will be used up by 2029. And of course, emissions won't stop there. Even if we still reach net zero by 2050, we'll blow our carbon budget out of the water. You can see why scientists say we should stop fixating on when we reach net zero. It's how much carbon we burn on the way there that matters. Failure to stay within our carbon budget risks catastrophic global heating, the suffering hard to imagine, the economic cost astronomical. The cost of prevention will of course be high, but nevertheless far lower, and the Climate Change Committee tells us there will be large savings to offset that cost. The UN warns of up to 1.2 billion migrants fleeing drought, famine and war over the next 30 years. An unimaginable tragedy, which our country will not be insulated from. So we must manage our carbon budget responsibly, year by year, to stay on track. Remember, this was the path we were supposed to take, a very different shape. So we need a mobilisation, at least on the scale of COVID, or perhaps even World War II, to face this crisis. Because we've left it so late, we must now reach net zero much sooner to stay within the carbon budget. This illustration starts with a 7% cut next year. Challenging, but possible. COVID took UK emissions down 11% in 2020. In the UK, newspaper headlines have claimed that we're halfway to net zero, but that's only on the very narrow measure of territorial emissions within our national boundaries. Once we add imports, aviation and shipping, all currently excluded, the fall in our total carbon footprint is much smaller, less than 1% a year. The government is simply following international rules. But if the UK moved all its production overseas, would that really mean our manufacturing emissions would be zero? Of course not. The rules are not fit for purpose and urgently need updating. On biodiversity, we also have a big hill to climb. The UK is one of the most nature-depleted countries in the world, with 1 in 7 native species facing extinction. Most people have no idea what a wildflower meadow even looks like. The good news is that if we just give it a chance, nature can recover. So what about the UK's plans going forwards? This chart shows the UK's progress in cutting emissions. First, I want to recognise that the government has come a long way with some ambitious targets, and it deserves credit for that. But there's a big problem. This is the net zero pathway that the government has committed to, but the government's own forecasts show that we're heading way off track. The government is under fire from key advisors, from the Public Accounts Committee for not having a plan, from the Climate Change Committee for failing almost all of its policy milestones, and from the Environmental Audit Committee, who've warned that there is no plan or funding for housing retrofit, which is crucial to success. The government has gone further than many other countries in announcing ambitious targets, but there are too many major policies working in the wrong direction. There's been an understandable urgency to refloat the economy post-COVID, but we seem locked into all our old thinking. We're even granting permits for new oil exploration. And then there's the issue of how to fund all of this. We cannot tackle a planetary scale problem with less than 1/25th of the cost of just one railway. Instead of spending money on airports, roads and high-speed rail, imagine if we spent it instead on insulating people's homes and installing pollution-free heat pumps, on renewable energy schemes and cycle and walking routes, cleaning the air for our children's sake. Suddenly it all seems possible. The money is there, we just have to spend it on the right things. Now, it's not just that we're way off track. The plan itself is flawed. The UK's net zero by 2050 legislation attempts to show that we are honouring our Paris Agreement aim to limit global heating to 1.5 degrees. It says that our 2050 target, if replicated across the world and coupled with ambitious near-term reductions in emissions, would deliver a greater than 50% chance of limiting temperature increase to 1.5 degrees. Now, there are multiple problems with this key statement, all very apparent to the rest of the world as we host COP26 later this year. First, it ignores the fact that populations and living standards are rising in continents like Africa, and so they have no possibility of cutting as quickly as us. It ignores that as the fifth largest historical emitter of CO2, we have benefited from burning fossil fuels for well over a century, and so bear more responsibility than poorer nations. It ignores the fact that developed nations like ours can afford to move faster than others. These are principles that we've already signed up to in the Paris Agreement. As we've seen, emissions were not reduced ambitiously after 2018. And what's more concerning is that our whole plan is not even judged likely to succeed by definition, as the IPCC defines a likely chance as 66% or above. Net zero by 2050 is based on a greater than 50% chance, or as the IPCC says, as likely as not. That's a mere 50-50 heads or tails toss of a coin. If by adopting the CEE Bull's 66% and above stance, the UK can improve the odds at COP26 as co-presidents, then perhaps a better future for us all begins to actually become likely. But there's another complication. It's not what we want to hear, but the science has moved on and it's getting worse, not better. Here are just a few examples that mean the original plan is no longer enough. Global average temperatures are understood to be 18% higher now than thought. The Earth's ability to absorb our emissions into plants may be much reduced due to heating and drought causing an acceleration in warming. The Gulf Stream that saves the UK from being as cold as northern Canada has now weakened by a worrying 15% and is still slowing. And it turns out that industrial fishing dragging change across the seabed releases more CO2 than international aviation. And hot off the press, a study showing how chemicals and microplastics dumped into our rivers unfiltered from sewage plants could cause a collapse in marine ecosystems in just 20 years. Now, we could put our heads in the sand, or we can square up to this problem and follow the science. The siren is sounding from all directions. Here is the government's own independent specialist advisor, the Climate Change Committee, on the launch of their latest progress report. The UK's climate credentials are marred by uncertainty and delay. Strategies have too often missed the mark. With every month of inaction, it's harder for the UK to get on track. The Prime Minister's 10-point plan was an important statement of ambition that has yet to be backed with firm policies. And it's hard to discern any comprehensive strategy in the climate plans we've seen in the last 12 months. So we didn't do what the scientists told us to. We've delivered little action. Our plan was always based on unrealistic assumptions and a pretty miserable 50% chance of success, and even then we're heading way off track. And the prognosis is worsening. We've learned that managing our carbon budget is of paramount importance. This is all pretty gloomy, but the scientists say there is still time to get on top of this crisis, but only if we act right now. Let's have a look at what's being proposed to help us find solutions. The CEE bill was developed with the help of eminent scientists to ensure these problems are addressed properly. It's a legal framework which would deliver policy and action in line with scientific advice, and it's oven ready. It would set us on track to a 1.5 degrees C future, which we've already signed up for in principle, as well as committing to key biodiversity targets to protect our beautiful countryside, so beloved by the British people. It would provide us with a forum where experts, ordinary people and politicians can engage constructively together. Tackling the climate and nature crisis has great potential for positive impacts. Accounting for our full carbon footprint would give a competitive advantage to British companies producing low carbon products on our ever greener power grid, bringing back jobs and improved security of supply, as well as reducing China's need for coal power. Hundreds of thousands of new jobs created in areas like home retrofit and nature restoration would be a fantastic way to deliver on the levelling up agenda. Rapid cleaning of our air would save up to 36,000 deaths a year, according to Public Health England. Conservative MPs are now in the unique position to be able to make this bill reality and hence take a key step in turning the ship around and reversing the ever-rising CO2 levels we saw in the first chart. This bill would set a gold standard for the world, just as the Climate Change Act of 2008 did, and those involved will go down in history in the most positive way. However, there are some objections to the bill flying around which must be addressed. First, that we're already on track, but we've seen that just isn't the case based on the government's own figures. The Environment Bill exists to tidy up loose ends as we leave the EU. It has nothing to do with climate or restoring nature. It doesn't even mention CO2, woodland, bees, carbon, fossil fuels, aviation. Forest only appears in relation to logging. So again, not correct. The proposed Climate and Nature Assembly, far from being the threat to democracy that some Conservative MPs have suggested, will help the government take the country along with them. People everywhere will see others just like themselves playing a meaningful role in the decision-making process, the great British public working hand in hand with politicians to decide our common future. Prominent Conservatives such as Alok Sharma and Kwasi Kwarteng have already spoken very favourably about the recent UK Climate Assembly. Most important of all, the bill ensures that Parliament will always have the final say over whatever the Climate Assembly recommends, retaining full sovereignty at all times. We still have time to choose our future, though very little now. As this great man said, it may sound frightening, but the scientific evidence is that if we have not taken dramatic action within the next decade, we could face irreversible damage to the natural world and the collapse of our societies. It's hard to imagine a starker warning. Or we can choose to follow the science, just as we did with COVID, and take bold, urgent action to stop burning fossil fuels and destroying our own habitat, ushering in a new era where through global cooperation and resources equally shared, where we thrive in balance with the rest of the natural world, we may for the first time in the entire history of humanity come to know what it feels like to be secure. Inaction is a choice which threatens the security of our country and indeed all of our progress as a civilization. If we fail to heed the loud warnings from scientists, how might the next generation treat those who failed them? What is the legacy to be that we leave them? And those in positions of responsibility with clearer knowledge now than ever before of the existential dangers we're facing really do have the weight of history on their shoulders. Whoever you are listening to this presentation, we urge you to do all you can to support the CEE bill and to help our elected leaders make those decisions responsibly. The survival of civilization is at stake. Thank you for listening.